What happens when pride meets destiny? When wealth collides with genuine love? Tonight's story will take you through the streets of Manhattan, where a powerful millionaire made the biggest mistake of his life with just one sentence. But fate had other plans. And what he destroyed with his words, he would spend years trying to rebuild. This is a story about second chances, redemption, and the price of arrogance. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with our viewers from around the world. And if you enjoy stories that make you feel, think, and believe in the unexpected turns of life, hit that subscribe button. We bring you new compelling stories every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's dive into our story. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse on Fifth Avenue, each drop racing down the glass like tears Manhattan refused to shed. Inside, the atmosphere was even colder than the October storm outside. Marcus Wellington stood with his back to the woman he'd spent 3 years with, his tailored Tom Ford suit perfectly pressed, his posture rigid with the kind of certainty only wealth and privilege could provide. "You need to understand something, Claire," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. He turned to face her, his steel-gray eyes devoid of the warmth she'd once believed existed there. Whatever this was between us, it was never going to be permanent. Claire Morrison stood frozen near the marble kitchen island, her hands trembling slightly as they gripped the edge of the cold stone. She wore simple jeans and a cream sweater, her auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail, still damp from the rain she'd walked through to get here. At 28, she had the kind of natural beauty that didn't require designer clothes or expensive makeup, the kind that made heads turn on the subway, in coffee shops, in the hospital where she worked as a pediatric nurse. "Marcus, I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Last week you said you loved me." "I said what people say in relationships," he interrupted, walking toward the bar and pouring himself 2 fingers of scotch. The amber liquid caught the city lights streaming through the windows. "But my mother made something very clear at dinner tonight. The Wellingtons don't marry nurses from Queens. We don't marry women without pedigree, without connections, without the right background." Claire felt something crack inside her chest, a physical sensation of breaking. "Your mother? We're talking about your mother's opinion about our future?" Marcus took a long sip of his drink, studying her with the same analytical gaze he probably used in his boardroom at Wellington Capital Management. At 35, he'd built his father's already successful hedge fund into a billion-dollar empire. He was used to calculating risks, cutting losses, making decisions without emotion. "She's right, Claire. I've been thinking about it objectively. You're beautiful. You're kind. You're good with people, but you don't fit into my world. The galas, the business dinners, the social circles I navigate, you'd be uncomfortable. And frankly, so would I. Constantly having to explain your background." "My background?" Claire's voice rose slightly, anger beginning to cut through the shock. "You mean the fact that I worked 3 jobs to put myself through nursing school? That my father was a firefighter who died in the line of duty? That my mother cleaned houses to make sure I had a chance at a better life? See, this is exactly what I mean," Marcus said, setting his glass down with a sharp click against the marble bar top. "You're too emotional, too attached to sentimentality. In my world, we make practical decisions. Strategic decisions." Claire stared at him, really seeing him for the first time. How had she missed this? How had 3 years of dinners and weekends and whispered promises in the dark blinded her to this coldness at his core? "Is this really about your mother, or is this about you being too much of a coward to choose your own life?" she asked quietly. Something flickered across Marcus's face, anger perhaps, or maybe something else, something he quickly suppressed. He straightened his shoulders, and when he spoke, his words were designed to wound. "Let me be completely clear, Claire, so there's no confusion going forward. What we had was fun. It was convenient, but it was never going anywhere permanent. You're a beautiful distraction, nothing more. And the truth is," he paused, letting his gaze sweep over her in a way that made her feel suddenly small. "No one in my world will want you. You don't have the education, the sophistication, or the breeding. You're a nurse from Queens who takes the subway to work. That's not who a Wellington marries." The words hung in the air like poison. Claire felt them settle into her skin, into her bones, into the soft places inside her where hope and love had lived just minutes before. The rain continued its assault on the windows, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear sirens wailing through the Manhattan night. "Get out," Marcus said, turning back to the window, dismissing her as he would dismiss an unsatisfactory employee. "My driver will take you home." "No," Claire said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'll take the subway. Like the woman from Queens that I am. She grabbed her coat from the chair where she'd left it when she'd arrived an hour earlier, when she'd still believed in them, still believed in him. Her hands shook as she pulled it on, but she held her head high as she walked toward the private elevator that would take her down 30 floors to the street level. "Claire!" Marcus called out when her hand was on the elevator button. She turned, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, she thought she saw something in his eyes. Regret? Doubt? But then it was gone, replaced by that same cold certainty. "Take care of yourself." She didn't respond. The elevator doors closed between them, and as the car descended, Claire finally let the tears come. By the time she reached the lobby, walking past the doorman who'd greeted her warmly dozens of times before and now wouldn't meet her eyes, she'd wiped her face clean. The rain soaked her immediately when she stepped outside, but she welcomed it, letting it wash away the last 3 years of her life. On the subway heading back to Queens, surrounded by late-night travelers and the rhythmic rocking of the train, Claire made herself a promise. She would never again let someone make her feel less than she was. She would never again believe that someone else's money or status or world was more important than her own worth. She didn't know it then, sitting on that rain-soaked subway seat, but that promise would change everything. 5 years passed like pages turning in a book. Marcus Wellington's life continued its predetermined trajectory. He dated the women his mother approved of, daughters of senators, heiresses to retail fortunes, society women whose names appeared regularly in the style section of the New York Times. None of them lasted more than a few months. He told himself it was because he was focused on business, on expanding Wellington Capital's portfolio into international markets, on the deal-making that earned him features in Forbes and Bloomberg. But late at night, in that same penthouse overlooking Fifth Avenue, he sometimes stood at those floor-to-ceiling windows and remembered auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail, remembered genuine laughter that wasn't practiced or strategic, remembered the way Claire had looked at him like he was more than just his last name and his bank account. He told himself he'd made the right decision, practical, strategic, the Wellington way. Meanwhile, in a completely different part of the city, Claire's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined that night on the subway. The pain Marcus had inflicted became fuel, became determination, became a fire that pushed her forward when exhaustion threatened to pull her under. She'd stayed at New York Presbyterian for another year after their breakup, working double shifts, saving every penny she could. She applied to the pediatric nurse practitioner program at Columbia University and, against competitive odds, got accepted. For 2 years, she worked full-time while attending classes, surviving on 4 hours of sleep and pure stubbornness. But she'd done it. And more than that, she'd excelled. 3 years after leaving Marcus's penthouse, Claire had graduated top of her class and landed a position at Mount Sinai's pediatric cardiology unit. 1 year after that, she'd published research on improving post-operative care for children with congenital heart defects. The research caught the attention of Dr. Robert Chen, a renowned pediatric cardiac surgeon, and together they'd founded a nonprofit called Little Hearts that provided free screening and care for children in underserved communities. Little Hearts had grown beyond anything Claire had imagined. What started as a single screening clinic in the Bronx had expanded to 12 locations across New York City. They'd screened over 10,000 children, identified hundreds with potentially life-threatening conditions, and provided life-saving treatment to dozens of kids whose families couldn't afford the care they needed. Claire's work had been featured in medical journals, in local news segments, and eventually in a human interest piece in the New York Times. The article, titled "The Nurse Who Sees Hearts," told the story of her father's death when she was 12, how she'd decided to go into nursing after watching the paramedics who tried to save him, how she'd built Little Hearts from nothing but determination and belief that every child deserved a chance at a healthy life, regardless of their family's income. The article ran on a Sunday in October, exactly 5 years and 2 weeks after that rainy night in Marcus's penthouse. Claire was in her office at Mount Sinai, reviewing patient files and preparing for the next day's clinic, when her phone started buzzing with congratulations from colleagues and friends. She'd almost missed the article entirely, too busy with work to check the news. Across town, in the boardroom of Wellington Capital Management, Marcus Wellington was supposed to be focusing on a presentation about emerging markets. Instead, he found himself staring at the New York Times his assistant had left on the conference table during the break. The headline on the style section had caught his eye: "The Nurse Who Sees Hearts." And there she was, Claire, older, her face showing the beautiful signs of a life lived with purpose, her auburn hair now cut in a sophisticated style that framed her face. She wore scrubs in the photo, sitting with a small child whose smile lit up the image. But it was Claire's expression that struck him, the pure joy, the sense of purpose, the confidence that radiated from the page. He read the article twice, then a third time, his coffee growing cold beside him. The Claire described in these pages had achieved more in 5 years than most people achieved in a lifetime. She'd built something meaningful, something that mattered. The article detailed her master's degree from Columbia, her research publications, the nonprofit she'd founded that was changing children's lives. There was a quote near the end of the article that made Marcus set the paper down, his hands suddenly unsteady. "Someone once told me I didn't have the education or sophistication to fit into certain worlds. That rejection was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to build my own world, one based on purpose instead of pretension, on compassion instead of status. I'm grateful every day for that painful lesson." He didn't need to guess who had said those words to her. The memory of that night crashed over him with sudden, nauseating clarity. Every cruel word he'd spoken, the way he'd dismissed her, diminished her, tried to make her believe she was less than she was. What had he been thinking? What had he thrown away? Marcus pushed back from the conference table and walked to the windows overlooking Manhattan. Somewhere out there, in one of those buildings, in one of those hospitals, Claire was saving lives while he was moving money around, making the rich richer, including himself. When was the last time he'd done something that actually mattered? When was the last time he'd felt the kind of joy that radiated from Claire's face in that photograph? "Mr. Wellington?" His assistant's voice interrupted his thoughts. "They're ready to resume the meeting." Marcus turned from the window, his decision already made. "Cancel the rest of my meetings today. I need to take care of something personal." Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus did something he'd never done before. He researched someone not for business purposes, but to understand their work, their mission, their heart. He read every article about Little Hearts, studied their annual reports, learned about the impact they were having. He discovered that while the nonprofit was successful, they were constantly struggling for funding to expand their services. Hospital space was limited, equipment was expensive, and there were thousands more children who needed screening. He learned that Claire had been trying to open a dedicated pediatric cardiology center in the South Bronx, where the need was greatest, but the funding gap was substantial. $2 million substantial. The kind of money that Marcus spent on a weekend yacht rental without thinking twice. He could write a check. It would be easy, but he knew that wasn't what this was about. Money was the lazy solution, the Wellington solution. Claire had built Little Hearts through dedication and sacrifice, not through buying her way to success. So Marcus did something else. He made calls to other hedge fund managers, to wealthy clients, to social connections he usually kept at arm's length. He organized a fundraising gala for Little Hearts, leveraging every relationship and obligation in his considerable network. He worked harder on that event than he'd worked on any business deal in recent memory. When his mother questioned why he was suddenly so interested in some nurse's charity project, he'd told her something that surprised them both. "Because it's the most important work I've encountered in years, and the woman running it is more impressive than anyone in our social circle." The gala was scheduled for a Friday evening in November at the Plaza Hotel. Marcus had personally ensured that every major donor in New York would be there. He'd convinced a senator to attend, got a famous surgeon to give a keynote speech, and pulled every string he could to make the event impossible to ignore. What he hadn't done was tell Claire he was the one organizing it. The formal invitation had come from the gala committee he'd assembled, with no mention of his involvement. He told himself he wanted the focus to be on her work, on Little Hearts, not on their past. But the truth was simpler and more frightening. He was terrified she'd refuse to attend if she knew he was behind it. The night of the gala arrived with the first snow of the season dusting Manhattan's streets. The plaza's ballroom glittered with chandeliers and possibility, filled with people whose combined wealth could fund a small country. Marcus stood near the bar, watching the entrance, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since he was a teenager asking someone to prom. And then she walked in, and the entire room seemed to shift. Claire wore a deep emerald dress that somehow managed to be both elegant and understated. Her auburn hair swept up to reveal the graceful line of her neck. But it wasn't the dress or her beauty that made people turn to look. It was her presence, the quiet confidence she carried, the way she moved through the room like she belonged anywhere she chose to be. She was accompanied by Dr. Robert Chen, her colleague and co-founder of Little Hearts, and Marcus felt an unexpected jolt of something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy. Were they together? The thought hadn't occurred to him before, and it hit him now with unwelcome force. Throughout the cocktail hour, Marcus watched as Claire networked effortlessly, talking to potential donors with genuine passion about Little Hearts' mission. She remembered names, shared specific stories about children they'd helped, made people feel like their contribution would matter. She was a natural, and people responded to her authenticity. Marcus waited until after the keynote speech, after the video presentation that showed the faces of children whose lives had been saved by Little Hearts. After the thunderous applause, he waited until Claire stepped out onto the balcony overlooking Central Park, probably needing a moment alone after being on for hours. "The park looks beautiful with the snow," Marcus said quietly from the doorway. Claire turned, and the recognition that flashed across her face was followed by something more complex: surprise, wariness, and something else he couldn't quite read. "Marcus," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I didn't know you'd be here. I should have told you," he said, stepping onto the balcony but maintaining a respectful distance. "I organized this gala for Little Hearts." Claire's eyes widened. Why?" "Because I read about your work, about what you've built, about the children you're saving." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because I wanted to help support something that actually matters." "That's very generous," Claire said, and he could hear the guardedness in her tone. "Little Hearts appreciates any support we can get." "Claire, I'm not doing this for Little Hearts." Marcus took a breath, diving in. "I'm doing this because 5 years ago I said terrible things to you. I was cruel and dismissive and wrong. I've thought about that night more times than I can count, and I—" "Stop," Claire interrupted, holding up her hand. "Marcus, if this is some kind of apology tour, you don't need to. What happened between us was a long time ago. I've moved on." "Have you?" The question escaped before he could stop it. "Because I haven't. Not really. I've dated the right women, made the right connections, built the company into something even bigger. I've done everything I was supposed to do, and I've been miserable." Claire studied him for a long moment, snowflakes catching in her hair like tiny diamonds. "That's not my problem to solve, Marcus." "I know," he said quickly. "I'm not asking you to solve anything. I needed you to know that I was wrong. About everything. You didn't need to fit into my world. My world was empty. You were building something real, something that matters, and I was too blind and arrogant to see it." "Why now?" Claire asked, her voice softer. "Why after 5 years? Because I saw your picture in the Times, and I realized that the woman I let go, the woman I insulted and dismissed, had become someone extraordinary. And the truth is, Claire, you always were. I was just too caught up in my own bullshit to recognize it." Claire was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting out over the snow-covered park. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "You know what the worst part was, Marcus? For months after that night, I believed what you said. I believed I wasn't sophisticated enough, educated enough, good enough. I let your words define me." "I'm so sorry," Marcus whispered. "Let me finish," she said firmly. "I believed it until I realized something important. Your judgment of me said nothing about my worth and everything about your values. You measured people by their bank accounts and their pedigree. I measure people by their kindness and their character. We were never going to work because we were never looking at the same definition of success." Marcus felt those words land like physical blows, but he knew he deserved every one of them. "You're right. You're absolutely right. The woman you see now, the one in the Times article, the one running Little Hearts, she didn't exist 5 years ago. That version of me had to be forged through the pain you caused. So in a weird way, I guess I should thank you. Your rejection pushed me to become someone I'm proud to be. You would have become this person anyway," Marcus said with certainty. "This was always who you were. I was just too stupid to see it." Claire turned to face him fully, and in her eyes, he saw not hatred or anger, but something more devastating: indifference. "I appreciate the apology, Marcus, and I appreciate what you've done for Little Hearts tonight. The funding from this gala will change lives, but I need you to understand something. I don't need your validation anymore. I don't need you to tell me I'm worth something, because I already know I am." "I know you don't need my validation," Marcus said, taking a step closer. "But can I be honest with you? Haven't you been?" "Not completely." He took a breath. "I'm not here just to apologize. I'm here because in 5 years, I haven't met anyone who makes me feel the way you did. I haven't found anyone who challenges me, who makes me want to be better, who sees past the money and the name to who I actually am, or who I could be." Claire's expression didn't soften. "Marcus, you don't actually know who I am anymore. We dated for 3 years, yes, but that was a different person. I've changed. My entire life has changed." "Then let me get to know the person you've become," Marcus said, and he could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I'm not asking you to forgive me, though I hope someday you might. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that I'm not the same person who said those things to you." "Why should I believe you've changed?"